Good day. My name is Ron Nikkel. Allow me to introduce myself. For more than 40 years, I have been involved with criminal offenders, prisoners, ex-prisoners, crime victims, prisons, and criminal justice officials. During this time, I have met with community and government leaders, as well as prisoners in 135 countries. And I have been inside more than 1,200 prisons. For 35 years, I served as the President and Chief Executive Officer of Prison Fellowship International, and I am now their President Emeritus. For about 8 years, I also served as the chairperson of the United Nations NGO Alliance on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, based in New York. I have also served as a board member or advisor with Advocates International, the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, the International Association of Volunteers in Criminal Justice, as well as a number of other criminal justice-related organizations. I know the prison world, and over the years I have seen firsthand the tragic failure of society in seeking justice by means of punishing criminal offenders through imprisonment. This is a global reality. Of course, I recognize that we find ourselves trapped in a dilemma. On the one hand, our common sense of justice requires that we cannot simply ignore people who commit offenses and that cause harm to others and threaten public safety. Justice requires that offenders be held responsible and accountable for their irresponsible, destructive, and sometimes violent acts against other people, against property, and against society. And on the other hand, our conventional ways of pursuing justice through the punitive imprisonment of those offenders typically results in greater harm than good. In most countries, the majority of offenders who are imprisoned today will not leave prison as more responsible, more productive members of society who contribute to the well-being of the community. The high rates of reoffending after imprisonment are proof enough of that. Proof that conventional imprisonment is not the answer. So we have a problem. If imprisonment does not remediate or transform the character and behavior of offenders from bad to good in the long term, then why do we continue using conventional imprisonment as if it is the only thing we can do? Now, before I continue any further, let me assure you that I am not a prison abolitionist. I know well enough that the community needs to be protected from violent offenders who need to be restrained. Imprisoning dangerous offenders may keep the community safe for a period of time. But when the offender is released from prison, will that person return to the community better or worse for their experience? We know that imprisonment is not the cure for criminal behavior, and yet we continue to imprison people for all sorts of crimes and expect that somehow prison will do them good and will change them for better. In general, and this is true globally, we rely inordinately on imprisonment and the idea that the worse the offense, the longer and more difficult the terms of imprisonment should be. It has been said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. No matter how many times we do prison, the results will not give us the results that we are looking for. That's insanity. Wherever I go in the world, the results of imprisonment are astonishingly the same. Imprisonment comes with a huge cost, and is consistently ineffective. According to prison research by the UN Office of Drugs and Crime in 2020, the recidivism rate in the Czech Republic is 66%. That is, 66% of the people who leave prison will either be rearrested, reoffend, or be reconvicted. According to Rule 4 of the Nelson Mandela Rules on Imprisonment, the purpose of a sentence of imprisonment that deprives a person's liberty is primarily to protect society against crime and to reduce recidivism. However, in practice, the realization of the reduction of recidivism is very limited. The justification for prisons and for punishment in general has been frequently questioned, and in most countries, prisons serve primarily as retribution, that is punishment, incapacitation, that means restricting the prisoner from further actions in the community, and deterrence, that is to cause other peoples to question whether such behavior is good for themselves. If rehabilitation exists at all, it exists in tension with the contradictory nature of the conditions of imprisonment. To be clear, and this is one of my main points here, the problem is not prison conditions, but the conditions of imprisonment. Whether prison conditions are horrific or luxurious, whether they are comfortable or uncomfortable, or whether they are overcrowded or spacious, none of this has any great impact on a human being as being deprived of freedom, isolated from family and community, and being forcibly institutionalized in a culture of negativity. I'm not saying that prison conditions are not important. Of course they are. But good physical conditions in and of themselves do not necessarily produce better and more reliable outcomes. It is the conditions of imprisonment, not prison condition. Let me repeat. The negative impact of imprisonment is not the physical conditions in which a person is confined, but the social, psychological, moral, and spiritual conditions of that confinement. There is nothing more dehumanizing than to be indifferent to someone and to treat another person as invisible and worthless. But that is what we do whenever we remove a person from the community and deprive them of freedom. We sometimes say out of sight and out of mind. And by doing so, we treat offenders as if we are sweeping them under the carpet like dust. The solution to criminality is not better prison conditions, but radically changing the conditions of imprisonment. And this begins with recognizing the humanity and dignity of the person, regardless of what that person may have done or not have done. Crime is a human problem. And when we are dealing with offenders, we are dealing with human beings. Crime is a social problem. It's a problem of the community, not just a problem of the individual. And when we imprison a person, that person is still a member of our community, and we are still responsible for their well-being. They are part of us, and eventually they will return to us. But the question is, in what condition will they return? If we separate ourselves from them and treat them with less respect and less kindness and less compassion, if we don't like them and if we label them as worthless offenders, criminals, evildoers, and if we keep our distance from them, it does neither them nor the community any good. One day I was visiting a very large prison of about 5,800 inmates. Just before he allowed me to meet with a group of prisoners, the prison director was giving me a tour of the institution. He was a stern man, not given to much conversation, all businesslike. As we were walking across one of the prison yards, we came across a dog. Not a guard dog, just an ordinary dog walking across the prison yard. Out of curiosity, I asked the director, "How many dogs are there in this prison?" Immediately he responded and said, 5,800. I have 5,800 dogs in this prison. I was shocked by the implication, but he was simply stating the obvious attitude of so many people toward those who are in prison. To him, as to many in the general public, every offender in prison is regarded as less worthy than a human being, regarded like an animal. How we see people is how we treat people, and how they inevitably think of themselves. There is something known as the Pygmalion effect, that the positive expectations and ways in which we treat people contributes to more positive behavior on their part. But the opposite is also true, that the negative expectations and the negative ways, attitudes we have toward people and treat people, that leads them to acting and behaving more negatively as well. Our expectations of people and how we relate to those people in prison will have a significant impact on them both while they are in prison and certainly when they re-enter the community. We cannot expect that deprivation of liberty and separation from family and community will change people for good. For justice to be accomplished, we must go beyond punishment and beyond the walls of separation to engage offenders within a framework, within a network of supportive, healing relationships, even while they are imprisoned. The cure for criminality, if we can speak of a cure, lies neither in punishment nor in rehabilitation, but in relationship. The reason why Vivian Stern, the English criminologist, describes the conventional use of imprisonment as a sin against the future is because of its destructive relational impact that multiplies through society and multiplies itself intergenerationally. I don't know what you think causes crime, but if you want to cure criminality, you must address the root of the problem. If the problem is under education, or if you think that's the problem, then education should be the cure. It doesn't work. If the problem is lack of work skills, then relevant skills training and work habits should lead us to a cure. But it doesn't. If the problem is unemployment, then providing appropriate employment should lead us to the cure. But it doesn't. If the problem is poverty, then financial aid and financial stability should be the answer. But it isn't. If the problem is a negative social environment, then relocation into a more positive social environment should lead us to a cure. But it doesn't. If the problem is one of a psychosocial nature, then psychosocial therapy and support should lead us to a cure. But it doesn't. If the problem is simply one of addiction, then addiction treatment and support should resolve the problem, but it does not. Of course, any of these factors may influence criminal behavior, but there is more to it than any one or combination of these factors. The bottom line is not one of focusing on a cure, but on caring for the person. Caring and meaningful relationship. Conventional imprisonment is not a caring environment in which offenders are nurtured and supported emotionally, morally, socially, spiritually, or psychologically. In fact, the conventional use of imprisonment is one of the most illogical approaches to criminality and the treatment of offenders. Think about it for a moment. Does it make any sense to confine an offender whose behavior demonstrates a pattern of bad moral choices in an environment that is populated entirely by people who also have a pattern of making bad moral choices? That is like treating a person with an infection by confining that person in a disease-ridden, infectious environment and expecting that person to be cured. The dominant moral influence in prison does not contribute to or support responsible moral behavior. Does it make any sense to confine an offender who has violated relationships and the trust of the community with other people in a prison society comprised of people with similar dispositions, especially in an environment of enforced separation from the normalizing community where the enforcers use coercive means of control? We know from global experience that imprisonment is often a breeding ground of hostility and violence between individuals and between the keepers and the kept. Does it make any sense to confine an offender who has exhibited antisocial behavior in an environment segregated from their family and community? This only drives social alienation ever deeper. Does it make any sense to confine an offender in an environment that deprives him of freedom and responsibility and decision-making and expect that person to return to the community better able to function in freedom, to be more responsible, and to make better decisions? I could go on to speak of prisons as a socio-economic, ecological disaster. Consider the collateral, relational, and social damage and the economic costs of imprisonment. Now, this is a U.S. statistic, but the United States, having one of the greatest prison populations, spends more money on corrections than almost any other country. The economic impact of keeping a person in prison is an average of $45,000, almost $46,000 per year. Overall, the U.S. spends over $80 billion on corrections and imprisonment. And this amount does not even reflect the true cost of imprisonment, which is the cost of the families, the cost to the families, the children, to the communities. And it is estimated that the overall cost of criminality, treatment of prisoners and imprisonment is over $1 trillion a year. Consider the social impact of imprisonment, broken families, and the negative intergenerational and cultural impact of imprisonment. Consider the personal impact on an individual who's incarcerated, the effects of institutionalization, stigmatization, contributing to their unemployability, unproductivity, homelessness, and alienation from the community, isolation. By now, you really are thinking that I am a prison abolitionist. I am not. But I am opposed to the overuse of prisons and the expectations that prisons, the way we conventionally do them, will work. It's not going to happen. But I know prisons can be done better. I have studied imprisonment all over the world. And while there are a few encouraging approaches in some countries, the only significant prison model I've come across is the APAC model that originated in Brazil. In APAC, prisoners are not even referred to as prisoners or offenders or as criminals. They are recuperandos, persons in recovery, socially, psychologically, morally, spiritually, physically, in a comprehensive and supportive environment of respect, dignity, responsibility, and a community in which relationships matter. I know you will be very interested to learn more about the APAC model. It is revolutionary. It is radical. It is courageous. And it is the only prison model that works consistently at a level that meets our expectations as to what should happen when criminal offenders are cared for, even though they are imprisoned.